Okay, so how many times has this happened to you? You get really excited about learning a new language, right? You sit down, maybe you've got the textbook open or you're using an app and you absolutely nail it. You learn some new words, maybe a tricky sentence, and you get this rush thinking, yes, finally, I've got this locked in.
Oh, yeah, that feeling is great. It's addictive, almost. But then, the real test, it comes like 2, maybe 3 days later.
Mhm.
You try to actually use what you learned. You try to speak, or maybe you hear someone talking, and nothing. Your mind just goes completely blank.
Yes, that beautiful vocabulary you worked so hard on
Hmm.
just vanished. And then the frustration just kicks right in. It's this cycle, isn't it? You quit, you feel bad, then maybe you try again later.
It really is. And that's the experience for what, like 95% of people trying to learn a language? It's incredibly common. And the worst part is most people immediately think it's them.
Right. They think, oh, I'm just not smart enough, or I guess I don't have a language brain.
Exactly.
Mm.
Okay, let's just pause right there. Because that assumption, that's the biggest myth we absolutely need to bust today. It has almost nothing to do with how smart you are or your memory capacity. Seriously. The reason that knowledge seems to just evaporate, it's purely down to how our brains are wired. It's a psychological thing, and it even has a name. It's called the forgetting curve.
The forgetting curve. Okay, sounds a bit technical.
Yeah.
Is it just our brains being lazy?
Haha. Not lazy exactly. More like ruthlessly efficient, which, yeah, I guess amounts to a similar thing in practice. Think about it like this. You learn a new phrase in Spanish today. Right at that moment, sure, 100% of it is right there, accessible in your short-term memory. But almost immediately, the clock starts ticking. Your brain's main job, deep down, is survival, and that means conserving energy. So within about 24 hours, it looks at this new phrase and thinks, okay, is this essential for survival right now? Have I used it again?
And if the answer is no.
If the answer is no, it starts the dilution process. It basically says, nope, not critical. Let's clear that space to save energy. It starts deleting it pretty rapidly.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, so that feeling, that awful feeling of knowledge just slipping away, that's actually normal.
It's completely, totally normal. Forgetting isn't a bug in your system. It's actually a core feature of how memory works. It's designed to do that. The failure isn't you. The failure is usually in the method you're using. Most traditional ways of learning languages, like in school, they kind of work against this natural forgetting process. They assume you see it once, maybe twice, and it should stick.
But it rarely does.
Almost never for long-term recall, not without the right strategy.
Okay, so that's our mission for this deep dive then. We're going to flip the script. We're diving into systems that are actually designed to work with our memory, with that forgetting curve. Turn it from an enemy into, well, maybe not a friend, but something you can manage.
Exactly. We're going to look at the systems that polyglots use, people who genuinely speak multiple languages fluently. We've synthesized advice from a bunch of experts in efficient language learning, people who figured this out, and we're focusing on actionable stuff, simple, repeatable methods that learn today, forget tomorrow cycle, methods that have helped thousands get fluent.
And the goal is real, usable fluency, maybe within about a year, assuming you put in the work.
Yeah, that's the time frame often cited, provided the commitment's there. It's definitely possible with the right system. So let's get started. First up, we need to challenge some of those old, unhelpful ideas about language learning.
All right, let's jump right in. Where do people usually go wrong? What's the typical time-wasting advice our sources point out?
Yeah.
Especially thinking about, like, this school approach.
Well, it's funny how often people fall back on that, isn't it? The traditional school model. Look, languages are fundamentally not learned by just memorizing endless lists of grammar rules out of context or, spending hours filling in blanks on some generic app.
If that worked, we'd all be fluent in whatever language we took in high school.
Precisely. The world would be multilingual. But it's clearly not the case for most people. You don't get fluent, you don't get conversational by just dissecting sentences on paper. You get there by actually producing sentences, by using the language.
Okay, so that's the old school method. But there's a bolder claim some of these experts are making, targeting a more modern trend. The idea of purely passive, comprehensible input.
Yes. This one needs a bit of careful handling because the core idea of comprehensible input, or CI, which comes from Stephen Krashen, a respected researcher, is actually sound.
Right, that's the idea of exposing yourself to language that's just slightly above your current level, the whole I+1 thing.
Exactly. Input is absolutely essential. You can't learn without it, obviously. You need to hear and read the language.
So, what's the problem then? Why are some experts calling the way people apply CI today nonsense?
The issue is the extreme passivity that's often advocated now. It's the flawed idea that you can just watch thousands of hours of Netflix or YouTube or whatever media, maybe without subtitles, and somehow magically your brain will just absorb it all and figure out the structure and let you speak without you doing much active work.
So just sitting back and binge watching is the issue.
Yeah. It's basically mistaking leisure activity for effective learning. Look, exposure is necessary, it's the fuel, but expecting fluency just from passive watching, it lacks the deliberate effort, the active engagement, the production that's needed to actually lock things in and be able to use the language yourself.
Okay, makes sense. Input is the fuel, but you need an engine, the output, the active work to actually go somewhere. So if endless grammar drills are out and purely passive watching is out, we need a clear target. What does fluent actually mean in a practical sense? Let's avoid the endless debates.
Good idea. Let's define it by what people can actually do. I think most of us would agree someone's functionally fluent if they can handle these key things easily. Watching movies without constantly hitting pause or needing subtitles, reading and writing emails or longer texts without major struggles, and crucially, having reasonably fluid conversations with native speakers without, freezing up or sounding completely unnatural.
And the sources we looked at point to one specific activity as a really good benchmark, a proxy for overall fluency.
They do. It's understanding a movie without subtitles. That's often seen as a key milestone. Why? Because listening comprehension is arguably the hardest and most fundamental skill. Experts like Steve Kaufman often say they meet people who can speak okay-ish, maybe slowly, but they completely fall apart when a native speaker talks back at normal speed.
Right, because real conversation is fast and messy.
Exactly. So if you can train your ear to understand language spoken naturally, quickly, like in a movie, the other skills like speaking, reading, even grammar accuracy tend to follow. The pattern recognition is the foundation.
Okay, movie comprehension it is. That's a solid goal. Now let's talk about the sheer volume. What does it actually take to get there? We need to look at those three core pillars identified by researchers like Dr. Paul Pimsleur and Dr. Paul Nation.
Right, the big three: pronunciation, grammar, and vocabulary. And yeah, the amount of work needed for each, it can be a bit eye-opening when you break it down.
So let's start with pronunciation. Seems daunting, all those new sounds.
It does, but it's actually the most finite part. For most common European languages, you're looking at mastering roughly 30, maybe 32 distinct sounds or phonemes. The total range across all languages is maybe 15 to 60 sounds, depending on how phonetically complex it is. But the real intense focus, it only needs to be on maybe half a dozen sounds, the ones that simply don't exist in your native language. Your mouth just isn't trained for them yet.
Okay, so pronunciation is manageable. What about grammar? That's one that scares people off, right? The endless rules.
It does, but again, the scope needed for real-world fluency, for understanding movies and having conversations is extensive, yes, but it's limited. Think about it this way. The essential grammar you need is roughly equivalent to what you'd cover in a solid 1-year university course, or maybe 2 years of focused high school study. The key takeaway isn't that it's easy, but that it's not infinite. It's a definable, achievable amount of structure.
All right. And the final pillar, the big one, vocabulary. This seems to be the real bottleneck, just because the numbers get so huge.
Yeah, this is where the scale becomes apparent. Pimsleur used to talk about needing around 5,000 words for operational fluency. But Dr. Paul Nation's work, which is really rigorous on vocabulary acquisition, gives us a more precise target, especially for understanding native media like movies. The benchmark for comfortably understanding most stuff, it's around 6,000 of the most common word families in that language.
6,000. Why that specific number?
Because studies show that to understand about 98% of a typical conversation or text, which is roughly the point where you can follow along comfortably without constantly stopping there, you need that 6,000 to 7,000 word family range. If you have much less than that, you're just hitting unknown words too often and comprehension breaks down.
6,000 words. Okay, let's do the math on that, assuming a 1-year time frame.
Right.
Because this is where the consistency thing really hits home.
Right. Cold, hard arithmetic time. 6,000 words divided by 365 days. That comes out to about 16.4 words per day. Let's just round it up to 17 new words every single day.
17 new words daily. And that's assuming you remember every single one perfectly from day one.
Which, as we just discussed with the forgetting curve, is completely unrealistic. You're going to forget a chunk of those almost immediately if you don't actively work to retain them.
So you need to learn more than 17 just to account for forgetting and the time needed for review?
Exactly. You have to factor in natural forgetting, plus the time it takes to review older words to really lock them in long term. So the experts we looked at, they calculate a more realistic, kind of conservative daily target to actually net those 6,000 retained words in a year. And that number is 20 new words per day.
20 new words every day for 365 days straight. Wow, that sounds less like learning and more like a forced march. Is that genuinely sustainable, or is that just some ideal number nobody actually hits?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it gets to the heart of the difference between just casually dabbling and using an engineered system. The consensus from these experts is yes, that pace is sustainable, but only if, and this is the crucial part, studying becomes a non-negotiable daily habit. You have to build the system so it doesn't depend on your initial burst of motivation, because we all know that fades. It has to rely on discipline and routine.
Okay, but what happens when you inevitably slip up? You get sick, you have a crazy day at work, you miss a day.
And that's the killer. That's the crunch point. If you miss one day, that workload doubles. Suddenly, the next day, you're not looking at 20 new words, you're looking at 40, plus catching up on the reviews you missed.
Ouch.
Yeah, missed 2 days. Now it's 60 new words. That pressure builds up incredibly fast. It becomes overwhelming, and that is why most people quit. They get discouraged, feel like they're falling behind, and just give up. The polyglots, the successful learners, they understand this. The secret to going fast isn't about being super intense for a week. It's about being relentlessly consistent, day in, day out.
Okay, so we need this massive volume, 20 new high-frequency words every day, consistently. But we also know just learning 6,000 random words off a list won't magically let you speak. You could know tons of nouns and still be totally mute in a real conversation.
Absolutely, that's a classic track. You spend ages memorizing vocabulary, but when it comes time to talk, you're still mentally translating word by painful word from English. It's slow and frustrating.
So how do we organize this daily learning? How do we make sure these 20 words or the sentences they're in are actually usable immediately?
The fundamental shift has to be away from isolated words and towards relevant sentences and whole phrases. You need to learn language in chunks that you can pull out and use in real situations without having to build the sentence from scratch every time. The focus must be on utility.
Right, like the difference between just knowing the word coffee versus actually being able to order one.
Exactly. If you just memorize cafe in Spanish, okay, you know a word, great, what can you do with it? Not much. But if you practice and really lock down the whole phrase, like, quiero un café con leche, por favor, you've got functional fluency for that specific situation. You can walk into a cafe, say the line, get your coffee, boom, goal achieved. That's the kind of utility that builds real conversational ability.
This brings us to that really cool analogy the sources use.
Yeah.
The idea of language islands. Can you explain that?
Yeah, I love this analogy. Think of language islands as these little safe zones, these specific common situations where you're likely to need the language early on. So one island might be introducing yourself. You learn everything you need for that. My name is, I'm from, I work as, basic greetings, asking the same back. That's one island.
Another island could be ordering food and drink, like the coffee example.
Precisely. Or talking about your hobbies, asking for directions, making small talk about the weather, these high-frequency scenarios.
So the strategy isn't to try and learn everything about the language all at once, like trying to boil the ocean.
No, absolutely not. That's overwhelming. Instead, you focus your effort, you build one island at a time, you take your daily target, those 20 words, or maybe the 100 sentences we'll talk about later, and you dedicate them solely to mastering everything for that one specific scenario. You nail the vocabulary, the common phrases, the necessary grammar chunks, even the pronunciation nuances for that island.
And only when you feel confident navigating that island, you move on to the next one.
Exactly. You conquer introductions, then you move to ordering food, then maybe talking about your family. Slowly, methodically, you build up this archipelago, this collection of islands.
And the benefit is, when you find yourself in one of those situations, say, someone asks about your job, you don't panic.
Right. You don't scramble for individual words. Your brain just accesses the talking about work island, and the pre-practiced, ready-made sentences just flow out. You've drilled them so much, the grammar and structure are baked in. You're not consciously thinking, okay, which verb tense do I need here? It just happens.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense strategically. But just having a list of sentences for each island isn't enough, is it? We still have the forgetting curve trying to sync our islands. We need a specific process for learning these island sentences, one that really burns them into memory and makes them active, not just passive knowledge.
Absolutely. Just reading the sentences isn't enough. The sources are clear. You need a cycle that moves you from passive input to active, fluent output. They're basically three key steps.
Step one sounds like it's about soaking it in. Repetition.
Deep, consistent repetition, yeah. It starts with internalizing the sound of the language. You need to listen to audio recordings of your target words and, crucially, the full sentences over and over again. Initially, maybe listen while reading the text to connect sound and spelling. But pretty quickly, you want to move to audio only. High volume repetition is key here. Listen while you're commuting, cooking, whatever.
Okay, lots of listening. Then step two, shadowing. What's that exactly?
Shadowing is where you start moving from passive listening to active production. It's simple but powerful. You listen to the native audio and you immediately repeat it out loud, trying to mimic the speaker exactly. You focus on matching their rhythm, their intonation, the melody of the sentence, the precise pronunciation. At this stage, it's less about understanding every nuance of meaning and more about training the physical muscles of your mouth, tongue, and jaw, building that motor memory for speaking naturally.
Got it. So listen lots, then mimic out loud. And then step three, which sounds like the most crucial one for actually remembering and using this stuff, active recall.
This is the non-negotiable part. This is the step that really signals to your brain, hey, this information is important. Active recall means deliberately trying to retrieve and say the target sentence from memory without looking at the answer or listening right before. You see a prompt, maybe the English version, and you force yourself to produce the sentence in the target language.
And it's that little bit of struggle, that effort to remember, that makes the difference.
Precisely. Your brain has to work harder to retrieve that information compared to just passively recognizing it or reading it. That tiny bit of cognitive effort, that slight struggle, that's what strengthens the neural pathway. That's what really locks the information into long-term memory and builds actual fluency, the ability to produce the language yourself.
And this whole cycle, repetition, shadowing, active recall, this is how you bypass that frustrating habit of translating everything in your head word by word.
Exactly. You're training yourself to think and speak in complete natural chunks in full sentences. This active production part provides the neurological kick that simple passive input, no matter how much you consume, just can't deliver on its own. It turns abstract study material into automatic, usable language that you can actually deploy in conversation.
Okay, so we have our high utility sentences organized into islands, and we have this active learning cycle, repeat, shadow, recall. But even with all that, the forgetting curve is still lurking, right? Still trying to erase everything overnight. So what's the practical defense? The answer that keeps coming up is spaced repetition systems, or SRS.
Yeah, SRS. It sounds fancy, maybe a bit intimidating, but the core concept is actually super simple. At its heart, SRS just means reviewing information at the optimal time to interrupt the forgetting process. Or, put even more simply, it just means reviewing the material enough times over a long enough period so your brain finally gets the message, okay, this stuff is important, I'll keep it.
And the smart part is that it stops you wasting time reviewing things you already know well.
Exactly. That's the efficiency gain. If you just reviewed everything you ever learned every single day, you'd drown in review. It would be impossible. SRS schedules your reviews, showing you things just as you're about to forget them, maximizing retention for the minimum necessary effort. But to handle the sheer volume we're talking about, those 20 new words, or maybe like 100 new example sentences per day, we need a really specific, practical routine for applying SRS.
Right. It's not just about using an SRS app. It's about managing the workload.
Yep.
Let's break down the kind of long-term review schedule these polyglot systems recommend. Say we're aiming for 100 new sentences a day as our input.
Okay, 100 new sentences. On day one, the day you first encounter that batch, you absolutely have to front-load the repetitions. You can't just look at them once or twice. To get them over that initial 24-hour cliff on the forgetting curve, you need to seriously engage with them. Listen, read, maybe try to say them 5 to 10 times throughout that first day.
And not all at once, right?
Yeah.
Spreading it out is better for memory.
Absolutely critical. Don't try to cram all 10 repetitions into 1 hour-long session. That's far less effective. Ideally, break it up into 2 or 3 shorter sessions, maybe review them in the morning, again midday or on your commute, and then one more quick review before bed. These short, spaced-out bursts are much better at signaling importance to your brain and moving information from your fleeting working memory into more stable, short-term storage.
Okay, so day one is intense, spread out review. What about that crucial first week when the memory is still super fragile?
Yeah, during week 1, you treat that initial batch of 100 sentences like precious cargo. You need to revisit them every single day, put the audio on, listen actively, do some shadowing, definitely practice active recall. try to say them from memory. This daily immersion for the first week is specifically designed to combat that steep initial drop in recall that the forgetting curve predicts. You're fighting hard against forgetting in that first week.
So week 1 is high-intensity daily contact, but then thankfully the schedule starts to ease up a bit.
It does, because by the end of that first week of consistent daily review, you've sent a strong signal. So in weeks 2, 3, and 4, you can relax the pace considerably. You only need to circle back to that original batch of sentences every 2 or 3 days. And the type of review can change too. You might rely more on just passive listening now, maybe less intense active recall for this specific batch, just to maintain the connection as it moves towards longer-term memory.
Okay, that sounds more manageable. And then what happens long term, say months 2 and beyond? By then you've got thousands of sentences piling up in the system.
Right. By the time you're a couple of months in, you've encountered those initial sentences many, many times in spaced intervals. You've probably seen the words from them pop up in newer sentences too. At this point, your brain has pretty definitively marked them as important, high-frequency, useful items. They're basically locked into your deep, long-term memory. The forgetting curve isn't much of a threat anymore for that specific batch. You probably only need to casually check in on them, maybe just hear them in a playlist once or twice a week just to keep the dust off.
Now, when people hear spaced repetition, I think many immediately picture digital flashcards, like using Anki, or maybe those exercises in apps like Duolingo or Memrise.
They do, and that association can actually be a barrier. Because staring at digital flashcards for hours, trying to review hundreds or thousands of sentences that way, it can get incredibly tedious.
Yeah, that sounds like a recipe for burnout.
It often is, and that's why people fail to hit the necessary volume of review. They give up on the tool because the process feels like a chore. But SRS doesn't have to be boring flashcards. For managing this huge volume, especially for the review stages after week 1, the most efficient method is often using simple audio playlists.
Okay, so you compile the audio for all your example sentences.
Exactly. You get the audio for those 100 daily sentences, put them on your phone or MP3 player. Then whenever you have downtime where your ears are free but your mind isn't intensely focused, like commuting, driving, walking the dog, doing dishes, working out, you just hit play.
So you could review potentially thousands of sentences passively without scheduling extra study time.
Precisely. This is how you make the massive volume sustainable. It integrates the review into your existing daily routines. You're getting those necessary repetitions, keeping the connections alive, without feeling like you're chained to a desk doing flashcards for hours. It turns review from a chore into a background process.
That makes the sheer numbers seem much less daunting. Because, yeah, sitting down to actively study thousands of sentences every week sounds impossible.
Totally impossible for most people with busy lives. And this highlights a key point. While software like Anki, Memrise, etc. are technically SRS tools, the most common failure point isn't the technology or the algorithm, it's volume and adherence. People don't stick with the daily input target, 20 words, 100 sentences, or they slack off on that critical intense week 1 review schedule. The initial motivation wears off. The real key, the polyglot secret, is to engineer your learning program so it doesn't rely on motivation. It relies on building low-friction, sustainable habits. Make the review easy to do, like hitting play on a playlist.
Okay, we've covered the massive commitment needed for vocabulary. The 20 words a day, the islands, the SRS audio playlist, that's huge. But fluency isn't just words. We still need to tackle the other 2 pillars, pronunciation and grammar. Let's start with pronunciation. You said earlier it's often considered the easiest pillar to improve.
Yeah, in theory, it should be the easiest because the number of sounds you need to master is relatively small, remember, maybe 30 or so for many languages. But people struggle immensely with it, and it usually comes down to one fundamental error.
What's that?
They see the word in their head when they try to say it. They picture the written letters. And because they're picturing letters, their brain automatically tries to map the sounds of their native language onto those letters.
Okay. So like an English speaker learning French sees the letter R and tries to make an English R sound, even though the French R is totally different and comes from the throat.
Exactly that kind of thing. Or seeing a Spanish V and making a hard English V sound instead of the softer B-like sound it often has. The visual representation interferes with the sound production, so the crucial solution is prioritize listening first. Immerse yourself in the sounds of the language before you worry too much about the spelling. And when you do practice speaking, try to consciously put the visual text aside. Focus on imitating the sound you heard. This is why high-quality native audio is so vital, especially early on. Minimize that visual interference.
And the sources really stress that getting the pronunciation close isn't good enough. We need to aim for precision.
Precision is really key if you want to be understood easily. Native speakers' ears are tuned very specifically to the phonemes of their language. What sounds like a tiny, trivial difference to you might actually signal a completely different word to them. Think about English, right? The difference between the vowel sounds in ship and sheep. It's subtle if your native language doesn't distinguish them.
Yeah, live versus leave, it versus eat.
Exactly. Those are different phones in English, meaning they change the word's meaning. If you mix them up, you cause confusion, maybe minor, maybe major. So you have to train not just your mouth to make the new sounds accurately, but also your ear to even hear the distinctions in the first place.
Okay, so how do we train these sounds effectively? Can we just practice the sounds in isolation, like drilling that French R over and over?
No, that's generally not very effective. Trying to practice sounds in isolation rarely works well because sounds change depending on what other sounds are around them in a word or sentence. They're contextual. Take that French R. It doesn't sound exactly the same at the start of rouge, red, as it does in the middle of Paris. The surrounding vowels influence it. So pronunciation must be trained using entire words and, even better, entire sentences. That's the only way to capture the natural flow and context.
Get the whole melody, not just the individual notes.
Perfect analogy. You need the whole musical phrase. And just like vocabulary, pronunciation needs consistent practice and reinforcement through your SRS system. It's a physical skill, like playing an instrument, and it can get rusty fast.
So skills can deteriorate. You can lose your good accent if you don't keep practicing.
Absolutely. That's a critical point people often miss. You need ongoing exposure and practice, listening to native speakers regularly, doing shadowing, repeating your SRS sentences out loud. That continuous input and output keeps the muscle memory sharp. Otherwise, your native accent patterns will creep back in. Pronunciation needs to be part of the daily routine.
Okay, makes sense. Now, let's tackle the beast. Grammar. People dread this. We have that target, maybe 2 years of high school grammar knowledge needed in a year, but the idea of sitting down with textbooks diagramming sentences.
Right, and the very first thing to internalize about grammar is avoid perfectionism. Seriously, if you wait until your grammar is flawless before you dare to open your mouth and speak, you will never speak. It's probably the single biggest reason people get frustrated and quit.
So, fluency first, perfection later. Or maybe never.
Kind of. Functional communication is the goal. You clean up the grammar along the way, mostly through more exposure and practice, maybe some targeted study later on. But don't let the quest for perfect grammar paralyze you at the beginning.
And this ties back to the idea that a lot of grammar isn't learned through rules anyway, right? It's more intuitive.
Exactly. For conversational fluency, the vast majority of the grammar you actually use gets absorbed organically, intuitively. You hear and read correct patterns thousands of times, and they just start to feel right. You internalize the structure without necessarily being able to explain the rule behind it, like how you learned grammar in your native language as a child.
You just know I go sounds wrong and I went sounds right without thinking about past tense conjugation rules.
Precisely, that intuitive absorption is powerful, and it helps overcome that fear of complex grammar tables.
There was a study mentioned, wasn't there, the Dulot experiment, that really showed this intuitive audio-based approach working better.
Yes, the Dulot experiment was fascinating. They compared two groups learning French. One group got the traditional approach. Lots of explanations, grammar rules, textbook exercises. The second group learned primarily through audio recordings. They listened, they mimicked, they repeated spoken phrases with minimal explicit grammar explanation.
And the results?
The results were pretty stark. The audio-based group, the ones learning through listening and mimicking, acquired the necessary grammatical habits much more easily with unexpected ease, the researchers said. Their spoken fluency was better.
Why did listening and repeating work so much better for internalizing grammar?
The conclusion was that learning rules is like reading the sheet music. You understand the theory, maybe, but you can't play the song. Learning through hearing and repeating the actual spoken phrases is like hearing the melody played correctly. You internalize the sound and rhythm of correct grammar. The audio group got the interpretation of the grammar directly, making it easier to reproduce accurately. The sources basically said learning from speech, from recordings, is the only way to get that interpretation fully and exactly.
Okay, so the practical strategy here isn't to throw away grammar entirely, but to combine this intuitive approach with our SRS system.
Exactly. You leverage the power of repetition and recall, but you focus on the right unit of learning. Instead of making an SRS flashcard that says rule, use imperfect tense for descriptions in the past, which is abstract and hard to apply.
You make a flashcard with a whole sentence that uses the imperfect tense correctly.
Precisely. You save flashcards with complete natural sentences that exemplify the grammatical point you want to learn. So, for that imperfect tense example in Spanish, your flashcard might have the English prompt. When I was a child, I played soccer every day, and the answer side is the Spanish. Cuando era niño, jugaba al fútbol todos los días.
And by drilling that whole sentence over and over with SRS,
You automatically internalize that era from ser and jugaba, from jugar, are the forms you use for past descriptions and habits. You absorb the pattern jugaba al fútbol, played soccer, needing the A, without thinking about rules. The repetition makes the correct sentence feel natural and automatic. You're building grammatical habits directly, not memorizing abstract rules. Hashtag outro.
wow, okay, this has been incredibly detailed. It really paints a picture of language learning not as some mystical talent, but as a system you can build and follow. High volume, smart organization, relentless consistency. Let's try and synthesize this down. What are the absolute core, actionable things someone listening can start doing today?
Okay, let's boil it down. Number 1. The daily habit and volume, this is non-negotiable. You must commit to daily study. Aim for that net target of 20 new high-frequency words, which practically means learning maybe 100 new example sentences containing them each day. Consistency trumped intensity here. That's how you hit the 6,000-word goal in a year.
2. Language islands for focus. Don't learn random words. Organize your learning around specific situations, introductions, ordering food, etc. Build these islands one by one. Focus on mastering the whole sentences you need for that situation, not just isolated vocabulary.
3. Smart spaced repetition, SRS. Use the forgetting curve. Front load your review heavily, 5-10 times spread across day 1. Review daily for week 1. Then, crucially, transition the bulk of your review to passive audio playlists. Listen while commuting, walking, doing chores. This makes the volume manageable.
And 4. Audio first for intuition and sound. Prioritize listening and shadowing, especially early on, to get the sounds right before the written word interferes. Train pronunciation with whole words and sentences, not isolated sounds, and use those full grammatically correct sentences in your SRS to absorb grammar intuitively, not by memorizing rules.
And here's the payoff, the light at the end of the tunnel for sticking with this kind of disciplined system. Within just 2 or 3 months, seriously, that quickly, of doing this structured daily work, you will have literally thousands of useful, ready-to-go sentences locked into your long-term memory through active recall and spaced repetition.
So you find yourself in that situation, you're traveling, you're in a meeting, you meet a native speaker, and instead of that deer in headlights feeling, instead of mentally scrambling and translating.
The right phrase, the correct sentence structure just comes out automatically because you've practiced it actively hundreds of times. You're not thinking about rules, you're just communicating, saying what you need to say. That's real operational fluency.
Amazing. That's the goal right there.
And maybe here's a final thought, something for you, the listener, to really chew on regarding your own learning habits. The real secret behind those polyglots, the people who seem to learn languages incredibly fast, it's almost never about being a linguistic genius or having a photographic memory or having unlimited free time.
It's the system.
It's the system, it's the consistency, yes, but fundamentally it's about a superior organizational strategy. It's about making that crucial mental shift away from, I need to know every grammar rule, towards, I need to be able to say everything I need to say using sentences I've practiced until they're automatic. That focus on usable output drilled through disciplined spaced repetition, that is how you stop forgetting what you learn. That's the strategic key to unlocking faster fluency.